Welcome back to Dispatch Faith. I'm your host, Michael Reneau, and joining me today is Karen Swallow Pryor, a writer, a professor, an all-around prolific thinker that most of you probably know. Her most recent book came out last year. It's called Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. She's got several other titles to her credit as well. She's a columnist at Religion News Service. And again, is just an all-around writer and thinker whose work gets out there quite a bit. Karen wrote a piece for Dispatch Faith this week, focusing on Christians and public education and the role that Christians have to play in supporting public schools and public education in general. So, Karen, thanks for taking the time to be here. I appreciate you joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, let's just jump right into talking about public education. Karen, one of the things you mentioned in the piece this week is that your husband is a public school teacher. You've worked in higher ed for most of your career. He's a public school teacher. I guess just from his perspective and maybe from your perspective too, I mean, how would you sum up kind of the state of public education generally in the country?
Well, I think we all know the headlines. We know there's a lot of problems, a lot of tensions, especially between public school systems and conservative Christians. A lot that's being debated and contested. And one of the things I say in the piece that it shouldn't surprise us that our children are really bearing the scars of our own battles that are going on, our own ideological and political controversies. So certainly, my husband has seen a lot of things change in his 20-year career in public schools, and much of it not for the better. But we essentially see it as not only a ministry, but also just a community institution that is part of where we live and that we want to support in whatever way that we can.
So, yeah, as you alluded to, I mean, there is this increasing hostility between, I think, political or cultural conservatives, certainly, but Christians, a lot of evangelical Christians, and Christians of other stripes too, kind of fall into that camp of kind of this rising hostility toward the public education system. You write in your piece that hostility was not always there. In fact, it really kind of went the other way. Can you just walk us through some of that history that you wrote about, and particularly some of the individuals and the work that they did?
Yeah, so I really start the history shortly after the Reformation and the Puritans. Just that's my area of study and research. And I just point out how committed Martin Luther himself was to public education for all. The Puritans who settled in America were very much in favor of public education. And then in my particular area of expertise, the 18th and 19th century, we see many people like Robert Raikes and Hannah More and Sarah Trimmer who were opening either charity schools or Sunday schools specifically to serve the poor and impoverished, because this is a time when public education, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. So the church and Christians were providing reading education, arithmetic education, Bible lessons, basic literacy and job skills to the poor, because they saw that not only as part of Christian ministry, but also an important part of the flourishing of all of society for everyone. So that's the history of Christians in a nutshell and public education.
Yeah, I guess some of the functions of public education, I guess we sort of end up taking for granted. I mean, 200 years ago, I don't know off the top of my head what an average, reading level would be if we kind of put it in our own terms. I think it's just basically expected of anybody who, even if you don't get through high school, I live in a part of the country where there are a fair number of folks who didn't make it through high school have GEDs, for example, but there's still sort of a baseline understanding, or I guess a baseline assumption of, having attained a certain level of education. That was not necessarily the case back for some of the folks you highlight in your piece, I guess, right?
Right. I mean, we really didn't have public education for all children until the middle and the later 19th century. So that's actually relatively recent in history. And of course, the people that I was talking about from Luther on were living in a predominantly Christian culture. And so they were leading the way. And so the tensions that we're talking about now obviously didn't exist because culture over these societies were overall more or less Christian, and now we live in a post-Christian world. So these tensions and hostilities are to be expected, but we can still look to our history and be inspired, I think, and learn from those who were leading the way in education rather than just being reactionary or polarizing.
Sure. So one thing you just touched on, kind of living in a post-Christian society. Um, so I come from evangelical world. I'm an evangelical Christian, as are you. Um, I was in public schools from kindergarten through all the way through high school. My wife and I went to a small private Christian college. That's where we met, where there was probably about a third of students there who were homeschooled, which has now caught on a lot more since the COVID-19 pandemic. A third who were private school, and about a third who were public schooled, like me. I guess one of the pieces of this conversation here lately has been Christianity Today published a piece a few days ago, basically arguing that Christians ought to have their kids in public schools, and that's a particular way to support public schools, but kind of arguing in favor of the benefits of having your kids in public schools. You don't really get into that particular realm in your argument, but I'm just wondering what you make of arguments like that. Christian parents ought to have their kids doing X, Y, or Z, because so many Christians, so many evangelical Christians right now are really arguing for, take your kids out of the public schools, don't have anything to do with them. How do you see some of those debates unraveling right
Right.
now?
Yeah, and just for the record, it was so interesting that piece came out. You and I talked about my writing this piece a month ago. Of course, it's back to
That's right.
school season, so this was on my mind. And of course, there are so many headlines about this issue. But yeah, I'm not really in my piece talking about where parents should send their children. I think having all of these options is wonderful, and every family is different, every child is different, geographical regions are different, and so whatever the particular needs of a family in a place are things that will change from family to family. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about supporting public education, I'm talking about the ways that we can just simply support it as an important institution in our communities, whether we like what's going on in there or not. And even when we don't like it, maybe it's even more important for us to offer support and help to the teachers who are there or to the students. We can actually be a positive force in this very important institution that we all have in all of our communities. And so in terms of where we send our own children, that is an important but separate question from what I'm talking about in this essay.
Sure. So,
And by the way, I wanted to just say, I also went to public school from K to 12, and I went to a private college, but it wasn't Christian, and then a state university. And like the Christianity Today article writer, I really saw her more as just arguing for benefits that people might not see, not necessarily that everyone should send their kid to public school. But she was
sure.
just talking about how she thrived in that environment. And I would say that I did as well. But again, these are individual decisions that need to be made with discernment and wisdom, and will change from situation to situation.
Right. That was one of the the college my wife and I went to. A lot of animated conversations took place around, well, when we get married and have kids, we're going to do this, or we're going to do that because I did this or I did that. And so we have 4 kids, and 3 of them right now are in our local public school system. And again, we live in East Tennessee. It's not Los Angeles or St. Louis or San Francisco or New York or whatever. 3 of our 4 children are in the public school system right now, but we have homeschooled all 4 of them up to a certain point, and then decided to put them in public school systems. But a lot of that for us, and I don't want to speak for anybody else, but a lot of that for us, like you said, was just dependent upon who the kid is, what the learning style is, what we thought we could do well. Our own particular school system plays a very large role in what we're comfortable with or what we're not comfortable with, and we certainly don't think or hope we're not abdicating our responsibility as parents to teach our kids what we think we ought to be teaching our kids and loving them as we ought to be loving them. So I get real frustrated with some of these conversations where it's a one size fits all, because it's just so opposite of, that's not reality, I guess.
Right, right. And it's wonderful that we have so many more options right now, and people can learn about these options through one another and support one another in that way.
I'm curious, remind me how many years you were at Liberty University as a professor there.
So I taught there for 21 years and then taught following that for a few years at a seminary. So almost
So
25 years almost in full-time higher education. And then of course, when I was working on my PhD, I was doing the adjunct thing. So in all, over a lot of years.
apart from, kind of a theology of education, or a pedagogical theology, I don't know, whatever you want, a fancy term you could throw on it. But apart from that, I'm just curious what you saw over your, quarter century in higher ed, what you saw, from students who were coming up into college, or, as you're working with them at college students. A lot of my professors would talk about, man, kids can't do this like they used to, or kids don't understand this like they used to. They may be better at X, Y, or Z, but A, B, and C, this has really changed over the last 20 years or 30 years, whatever. I'm just curious what kind of broad observations you might have about, education of kids in general by the time they get to the college level.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. There were a lot of things that I kind of wanted to address in this essay, but I could really only do so much. And again, because I did come from an almost entirely public and certainly entirely secular education, it was really interesting for me to go into a place like Liberty University. Now, I did, and I couldn't get into this in the essay, I was actually the principal of a Christian high school for 6 years during my PhD work before going to Liberty. And that's actually where I learned to fall in love with Christian education. And I recognized the things that I didn't gain in my own education: Christian worldview, integration of the subject matter with biblical teaching. And so I just adored that about Christian education. And so I went to Liberty very much on fire for and passionate about teaching my students how to integrate whatever they were studying with their Christian faith. And I still adore that about Christian education, and still do that in what I write, I hope. But what I saw in terms of maybe things I hadn't been exposed to before was the sort of atrophying effect that being immersed in a Christian or evangelical subculture can have on students' faith. Now, there are ways to counteract that, but I just saw over 20 years worth of young people brought up in an evangelical subculture who, many of whom have left the faith, far too many to make me comfortable or happy. I mean, obviously these things are going to happen, but I think there is an element of just too many assumptions, not challenging, not offering the opportunity to ask questions, for students to ask questions and grapple with things that if they do that later in life, it's like a deal breaker for them. And so that should never be a deal breaker. We should be modeling that ability to ask questions and to compete, let our own worldview compete with other worldviews, no matter where our students are being educated. And I think that will bolster them against the chances of leaving the faith later when they encounter these things for the first time.
I don't want to presume that that you think that there's kind of a silver bullet sort of answer for some of those issues that you're remarking on, but I do wonder. I mean, when I was in school, kind of the resurgence of apologetics was really catching fire. To talk like evangelical baseball for a minute, kind of worldview education, which I appreciated when I got to college. I appreciated sort of the framework that way of thinking about different religions, or just the perspectives people are coming from. It helped me kind of see the logical ends to certain presuppositions or assumptions people have. But I guess, Christian education, and I think Christians who are trying to educate their kids, even if they're not in a Christian school, kind of go through these phases where it seems like this mode of thinking or this type of curriculum might be helpful. I guess, do you have any take on, do we need more of this or less of that, or is it something a bit broader or harder to get your arms around than even just kind of what kind of curriculum you might want to get your kids into?
Well, I do have a take, believe it or not. So, in my own story, as I said, having been educated entirely by secular institutions, it was encountering Christian worldview that really changed my life and brought my faith into maturity and passion. And a lot of that, by the way, this is a part of our history, and I don't know if we've talked about this, we may have, but it was World Magazine where you once wrote that did that for me, that introduced me to worldview thinking. And so when I left my PhD program at a state university and went to this evangelical institution, I was very passionate about teaching Christian worldview, not only to my students, but to other faculty, because it was still sort of catching on there. And so I emphasized that for a long time, and I still love Christian worldview. It's how I think and how I operate. But I also began reading James K.A. Smith and similar thinkers along the way. And that's where I started to have some of my questions answered as I watched so many of my students walk away from the faith. And again, I'm not talking about a majority. I'm just talking about enough to break my heart. When I started watching students walk away or live in ways that weren't really biblical, I would almost say to myself, wait, I taught them how to think. I taught them Christian worldview. Why aren't they thinking and acting and living the right way? And what the work of Jamie Smith and others have shown me is that, just to put it the way he puts it, we are desiring creatures before we're thinking creatures. We aren't just heads on sticks, but we develop loves and desires and affections. And so educators and parents need to be aware not just of the right answers or the correct application of biblical worldview to this issue or that issue, but we need to pay attention to what our young people are learning to love, how they are being formed, not just in school, but by their social media and their entertainment, how they are being formed to have affections for either good things or bad things, and to try to form in them and develop in them the desires for what is good, which is far more than just the right answers on an apologetics quiz.
Yeah, absolutely. So the two books Karen kind of alluded to, Desiring the Kingdom and You Are What You Love, both of which are really fantastic. No, I mean, that's, again, not to go back to this, but that's so much of our conversations with our kids and the situations that they're finding themselves in. The oldest is in 8th grade and the youngest is 7. It's about seeking the right things, not just knowing the right answers or even asking the right questions. I mean, that's part of it. But I guess, I mean, so you spent you spent a good part of your professional career trying to cultivate the imagination. So I guess that ties into that a little bit. This is the second piece that you've written for us at the Dispatch. A few months ago you wrote a piece. Actually, you were the inaugural essayist in Dispatch Faith, the newsletter, which I greatly appreciated. But you wrote in that first essay addressing kind of Christian nationalism and the Christian nationalists, and the way you define that is in the piece, so people can go back and read it. But their kind of lack of imagination. And you wrote, the primary question Christian nationalism claims to ask, namely, what does it look like for people of faith to advocate in the public square for public policies they believe will do the most public good, cannot be answered with tropes, types, and cliches. Such are the makings of a flattened imagination that can only deal with ideas and not the real world. And I just kind of piggybacking or dovetailing with what you just said a second ago. I mean, what does it mean to deal with the real world as opposed to just dealing with ideas? And you put this in the context of kind of Christian nationalism and a bunch of tropes that kind of get spat out, or the memification of reality, I guess. But what does that mean to have an imagination that can only deal with ideas and not the real world?
Well, of course, I'm drawing on my area of interest and expertise, which is literature. And there is different kind of literature or art that deals in tropes and others that are deal in complexities. But to broaden it out, again, going back to the example of apologetics, and I love apologetics. Some of my best friends are apologists for the faith. But if we are just training our young people to spit out answers to questions and to not consider the complexities or not to consider the point of view of someone else, or to just completely dismiss that based on black and white or tropes or memes, or arguments that are laid out for us in advance, then we're setting them up for exactly what I was addressing in that essay, and maybe more indirectly in this essay. And so part of the role of the imagination is to just simply cultivate an imagination by which we can imagine why someone would think this way, would believe this value, would vote this way. That's not agreement, but at least understanding the perspective that they may be coming from that we don't share, and that a person could be of good character and good faith in making this decision or believing this thing. And if we don't have enough imagination to understand why that might be the case, then we're actually shooting our own beliefs and values in the foot, because they can't withstand accommodating and incorporating that point of view.
Yeah. You make this point in this week's essay, and you made this point a little bit earlier. I mean, we were living in a post-Christian society. So I've been reading and thinking a lot about stuff that James Davison Hunter has been saying for a long time, but his most recent book touches on this too. Talks about it in terms of solidarity. There's not much solidarity, cultural solidarity, or even like epistemological solidarity anymore in the country the way that we had, going back not that long ago. I guess when it comes to Christians supporting their local school systems, and supporting public education more broadly, I mean, you draw on these historical examples, but what might it look like to do that in a place where you can't assume that everyone's coming from the same place, where the idea that you were just trying to communicate, cultivating imagination for trying to understand how someone might view the world much, much, much differently. I mean, how do you think that might look different now, that support, than it did, say, 200 or 300 years ago for some of the folks you name in the essay?
Right. I mean, we do live in a pagan culture, not just in the sense that it's not Christian, but even in the classical sense, where there are so many different competing ideologies and religions and beliefs. There isn't one prevailing one. It's a very pluralistic kind of world in that sense. And so when I talk about, and I use this word in the essay intentionally, I talked about strengthening the public schools, because just flat out support everything that they do is obviously just it would be silly for anyone to do, not just Christians, because we're never going to support everything or believe in everything. But a way to strengthen them, I mean, there are so many things that we can do to be involved. I mean, obviously there was, we can be involved in school board meetings and decisions, but not in the ways that to make headlines and get on TikTok. I don't think that's constructive. We can find out what teachers in our schools or even in our own congregations who are believers may be teaching in those schools, and support them in that way to find out what's really going on. How can I help? How can I volunteer my time? How can I offer my expertise? It's so much easier to just make a splash and make a headline, or take a controversial position, but there are many other ways that more directly can, again, just as if we were missionaries in a foreign land trying to serve the culture that we are ministering to, we would do that in hopefully very constructive ways, that by building relationships and building our knowledge of that culture. I don't see why we should be doing it any differently here in this post-Christian culture.
Yeah. You said a second ago, and you pointed out in the essay too, um, a lot of the hostility, again, it's coming from cultural conservatives or political conservatives. I mean, evangelical Christians, and again, Christians of other stripes too, are largely a part of that conversation. But you point out more than a third of public school teachers are actually evangelical Christians. I'm thinking one of my best friends from my church is a teacher in the public schools, and he kind of brings back these issues that he is trying to help these kids go through, and he brings them back as points of prayer. So I just appreciated that particular reminder. I think about your husband too. But that kind of the culture warring posture. sets us up as always adversarial against, these kind of impersonal forces, public school systems, the teachers unions, or the this or that. But they're staffed by actual human beings, and a lot of whom we have more in common with than we think we do, by virtue of our shared faith.
Exactly. And I want to speak. There are going to be people out there who claim the name of Christ who are about something else. They're out there, and I'm not speaking to them, but to those who might be sort of caught in the middle. And I want to say that I absolutely agree that the left and the liberals are doing things in public schools and implementing things in public schools that we cannot support and do not want to support, of course. And yet, the way to change that is to be Christ-like, to have a servant mindset, and to build relationships and friendships in our communities and in the schools. That's how it's always been done, in around the world and throughout church history, and that's how to do it now. I mean, unless our program is about something about cliques and grift, but we don't need to be part of that.
I can't imagine anybody to be for that. I can't. No, nobody in this sphere is just chasing clicks or looking for an easy dollar. I want to change gears for the last few minutes of our conversation. So one of the other kind of stories within our side of things in evangelical Christianity, I guess, last week was the release of a Confession of Evangelical Conviction. You were one of the original, I guess, signers of that. A lot more folks have signed on since it was released last week, I think. Just real quick, what is that confession? What's it all about, and why did you put your name to it?
Yeah, it's a confession specifically speaking to our current and upcoming election season, and it's something that evangelicals across the board who may be voting for different candidates can agree on in terms of what we believe about the proper role of politics in the life of the Christian, and also our beliefs about my favorite statement from it is that we will lead in love, not fear, because there's a lot of fear out there, and some good cause for it, but we still need to actively embody the love of Christ and cast out fear. And so it was signed by a number of people, many, again, on the record, voting for a range of candidates. I'm on the record as I'll be voting for a third party candidate that reflects my values and beliefs the best. And I signed it. It's interesting. I've had a number of conversations about it. And the recurring refrain that I hear from people is that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but even 5 years ago, there would have been nothing controversial about this statement at all. It is steeped in scripture. It says some of the most basic Christian belief about our priorities, our values, our convictions. It says things that evangelical leaders, even in the political realm, were saying 10 or 20 years ago about the character of our elected officials and so forth. It's something that would have been a nothing burger just a few years ago. And the fact that it's controversial now and being seen as coded as for one candidate or another just tells you how married our evangelical faith is with politics today. And we have to step back and remind ourselves of our first love and remind ourselves of these scriptures that are eternal and universal and not limited to just American evangelicalism in the 21st century. And that's why I signed the statement.
Why? So I guess one question I always have when statements like this come out is not just the content of the statement itself, and I do want to ask you a couple of things about that too. Not just the content of the statement itself, but actually having a statement.
Yeah.
Why do statements like this matter? Why put something out publicly to begin with for something along these lines?
Well, I'm going to repeat the answer given by one of the lead authors in a press conference we had earlier this week, because I think this gets to my heart in signing it as well. It may not make a difference in the sense of it's not going to sway anyone's vote, but it is because it is basic teaching that we all would have agreed on and would have been non-controversial a few years ago. It actually is a statement that is for the future. It is, and not just the far away future, but for young people today who are in the church, who are they really are confused and thrown by this, our political context right now and how it's dividing the church. And so if they can look and see that there are people who claim the name of Christ, people who call themselves evangelicals, and who are publicly and strongly proclaiming these very biblical principles, then perhaps they can be emboldened in their biblical faith. I mean, this is what Christian worldview is about, and so it's for other people to see that they're not alone, they're not crazy. This really is an expression of basic Christianity, and it's proper relationship with politics that I think many of us have lost sight of. I lost sight of for a while. I was much more politically driven and motivated in past years than I am now. And I'm trying to also return to my first love.
So what did that look like for you when you say that you lost sight of that and you were too politically motivated or engaged? I don't know. I mean, kind of fleshing that out. What did that
Right.
look like for you then
Yeah.
versus
Yeah.
now?
I mean, I don't mean to say you can be too politically engaged. Obviously, we're all called to different things, and we need godly, political activists and elected officials in there. But I think that I had my eye on a prize, specifically the overturn of Roe versus Wade, which we won. We got that prize. And yet it didn't do, not only did it not do what we hoped it would do, but in many ways, I think it has set the movement and our goal back in many ways. Now that's sort of maybe I'll have to write an essay about that. But actually, I think Marvin Olasky in Christianity Today, just a couple of weeks ago, for anyone who wants to read that, he said really what I would say on this issue, only better. And so there are others. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that we've have a setback in terms of not just the pro-life movement for ourselves, but I mean our actual goals, because abortions are on the increase, they're on the rise. We're turning hearts away rather than toward our position. So that's probably the easiest and most dramatic example that I can give, where I put too much faith in a political accomplishment, and it wasn't enough.
So you talked about the one point about the in terms of the content of the statement I wanted to ask about was the point you highlighted. We will lead with fear, not love. I mean, you've talked a little bit
We will
about.
lead with love, not fear.
Sorry, love.
Yeah,
Yeah, sorry.
yeah.
Love was, that's an
However it
important
was worded,
distinction.
yeah. I knew what
Yes,
you
we
meant.
will.
I may have said it incorrectly a minute ago.
No, you didn't. I had it on my notes incorrectly. This is why I don't multitask very often when I do when I prep for stuff. We will lead with love, not fear. I mean, you've already kind of talked about even the cultivation of imagination. You've already talked about things that hit on that. I guess my one question for you is, I think a lot of folks would read that statement and say, it doesn't mean you can't. It doesn't mean you should be, naive or kind of Pollyanna-ish about the kind of the headwinds in the culture right now.
Right.
And you've already touched on some of this animosity in a post-Christian society where several decades ago probably wasn't the case. So where do you think Christians can draw the line, or maybe see the lines between fear and kind of a sober understanding that things are not as they once were in the country? Not that they were ever perfect by any means, but things have changed over the last 60, 70, 80 years. How do you draw some of those lines between fear and then just that sober reality, I guess?
Well, I do want to say, when we look at how things have changed over the past 60 or 70 years, some of the changes have been very much for the good of some people who had it very bad 60 or 70 years ago. And we often say these things from our own perspective or our own place, forgetting that others have not had that place. And so, I mean, I think if there were a way to sort of put a formula to all the sin in a culture and a time, I think it would remain pretty constant. It's just that we would replace one sin with another, or one error with another. And so we definitely are facing certain errors right now, and there is much to fear. And I would say that even before we can get to leading with love, not fear, I think we have a lot of work to do to correctly name our fears. I think sometimes we say we're afraid of this happening when really we're afraid of something else happening. And we have to be honest about what our fears really are. Are they really for our children, or are they really for culture, or what are they for? And we're actually seeing some people who are being very transparent about their fears. I'm seeing some people say, for example, in the way that they vote and the power that they want to wield is because they love their own families and children more than the families and children of others. They say that. And so I think, okay, that's being honest, because you're saying your fear is about your own self rather than others. And so that's a start. And so we need to be honest and say, how much do we really trust the Lord with our own children? And how much do we really believe that he has won the victory? And how much do we really believe that our faith is in America rather than in the kingdom of heaven? So asking, again, going back to asking questions and correctly naming our fears, I think can help us to get to the place where we can lead with love rather than those fears once they've been correctly named.
So that's a Confession of Evangelical Conviction, so folks can go find that online. I have one other question. It's September 12th, so we're getting on into the fall, and we've been talking about fear. Give me a couple of reasons why folks should go back this fall and read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which you know a thing or two about, I guess. This question was actually one of my former World coworkers. I told her I was going to be talking with you today, and she said, why do I need to go ahead and pick up Karen's book on Frankenstein? So,
thank you so much for asking. Now, first, for anyone who hasn't read the book, you absolutely must read it, because it is absolutely nothing like our pop culture versions of it, the film versions of it. There's no film version of it that really gets it right. And even some stage productions, which are excellent, still are, really stray from the book itself. The book itself is extremely theological and philosophical. It's really all about God and about the relationship of the creator with a creation that is fallen and hideous and corrupt, as we all are. So it's a much different novel than you might think it is. If you've already read it, you should definitely reread it. The version that I have edited with B&H Publishing is actually the rarer version. It's an earlier version, not the final version, which Shelley edited and changed over the years. So this is a sort of more raw and more honest wrestling with those questions about our relationship with our creator and what do we do when we didn't ask to be here. So it gets to the heart of some of our most existential, theological, philosophical, and human questions. And I hope everyone will read it.
I'll just say, I still have Gene Wilder in my mind as we talk about Frankenstein, so it's hard to.
I know, such a shame.
It's hard to reconcile the two pictures there. Karen, thanks so much for joining me today. I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Folks can find your essay this week at Dispatch Faith. Anything else people should be watching out for coming from you in the near or medium long future?
Well, I guess the biggest thing is that next year, my next book will be out, and it will be on vocation and calling, which is something I've been wrestling with in my own life, and I think many of us do from time to time. And so I hope that's something that will have a little something to say to most people.
All right. Thanks so much, Karen. Take care.
Thank you, Michael.